Tuesday, May the 11th, and you're watching GoodFellows, a Hoover Institution broadcast examining social, economic, political, and geopolitical concerns in this time of pandemic. I'm Bill Whalen. I'm the Virginia Hobbs Carpenter Fellow in Journalism here at the Hoover Institution. I'll be your moderator today. That means I have the high honor and privilege of introducing three of my colleagues, all Hoover Institution senior fellows, who we jokingly refer to as the GoodFellows. We begin with John Cochrane. He's an economist and the Hoover Institution's Rosemary and Jack Anderson Senior Fellow. Hello, John.
Hi, everybody.
Our second GoodFellow is Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. General McMaster is a former presidential national security advisor. We're proud to have him here at the Hoover Institution as the Fouad Michel Ajami Senior Fellow. Hello, H.R.
Hi, Bill. Great to be with everybody.
And our third GoodFellow, Niall Ferguson, the Hoover Institution's Milbank Family Senior Fellow. Niall is also a renowned historian and author. His latest book, Doom, the Politics of Catastrophe, came out last week. That was the topic of our show last week. Go back and watch it. Better yet, go buy the book and read about it. Hello, Niall.
Hi, Bill. And I have a news flash. An even bigger event last week was that the GoodFellows got together and in a non-socially distanced, mask-free way, we had dinner at my place. And there's photographic evidence to confirm this. So we are capable of being together in the same room at the same time. This Zoom thing will soon be but a bad memory of the past. So yeah, that's my breaking news. GoodFellows got together.
Good headline, Zoom is doomed. So, gentlemen, the topic this week is higher education. We thought this would be a timely conversation, given that graduation season is upon us. Schools such as Stanford, where the Hoover Institution is located, is coming to terms with what to do this fall. And we've seen universities struggle not just with pandemic, but the greater question of the Great Awakening. So we have a guest today who knows a thing or two about what it is to run a great American university, and that is Mitch Daniels. Mitch Daniels is the 12th president of Purdue University, a post he's held since January of 2013. He came to West Lafayette, Indiana, after 2 terms as the 49th governor of the Hoosier state. Prior to that, he held leadership roles at Eli Lilly and Company, the Hudson Institute, and for masochistic reasons only he can explain, the Federal Office of Management and Budget, meaning that it was his job to make sense of how Washington spends your tax dollars. President Daniels, welcome to GoodFellows.
Appreciate being here. It's both an honor and a little bit intimidating. This group asking me about the higher ed, what next week, I suppose Nick Faldo and Jim Nance will ask me to comment on golf, but I'll do my best.
Thank you very much. So a thing or two I learned about Purdue in the course of getting ready for this show, President Daniels. No tuition increases for over a decade now. A civics literacy graduation requirement for undergraduates. You believe in intellectual diversity. Last month, Hoover Shelby Steele spoke as part of the university's Pursuing Racial Justice Together initiative. You're the first major U.S. university to offer income share agreements to incoming junior and senior level students, i.e. you're trying to help them pay down their, get through college without incurring massive debts. You're an innovator in distance learning for adults. You dared to reopen your university last August. And for all this, a columnist called you, quote, the closest thing I know to an academic secular saint. So President Daniels, Governor Daniels, your holiness, if you will, at a time when universities have been disrupted, brought to a halt, brought to their knees by the likes of COVID and the woke culture, what does your school get that others don't?
I don't think we're doing anything that wasn't part of our land grant heritage, isn't part of our, I suppose, to some extent, Midwestern upbringing and culture. But I suppose we saw the obvious a few years before some in our sector, namely that people were distressed and beginning to be severely pinched by the ever escalating cost of higher education, and finally, belatedly, asking the same question they ask in every other realm of life: is there value here? Am I getting something commensurate with the price I'm being asked to pay? And so we've been working on both ends of that equation. We've invested heavily in quality. I wouldn't want that to be overlooked, and continue to do that. But the denominator, of course, is price, and we have held that constant. In fact, in nominal dollars, it's because of some fee reductions, it's actually less expensive to come here now than it was in 2012, again, in unadjusted dollars. I run into a lot of California students and students from other places who tell me it was less expensive to come here than to stay home.
So cheaper to go to Purdue than to go to UC Berkeley or UC Santa Barbara. I don't want you to name names or throw other schools under the bus, though, but why do other universities seem just so paralyzed by what to do vis-a-vis the pandemic, but also what to do vis-a-vis free speech on their own campuses?
That's a very long subject, and there's some very good books you can all repair to if you really need to know more about this. I think that there are two separate but parallel phenomena here, I suppose. With regard to free speech and the sad erosion of diversity of thought on campus, in fact, the enforced conformity that seems to predominate a lot of places, this is simply the very natural consequence of multiple generations of people selecting, as we're all prone to do, people like themselves. And in this case, with the additional built-in inertia of lifelong employment. And so I think that explains the monolithic, more than anything, the monolithic intellectual culture on too many places. And then with regard to the last year, I guess I'll just say that a sector which has been so insulated, really immune to until recently to market pressures, felt in too many instances comfortable taking the route of maximum safety as they saw it, as we saw it at least, not paying enough attention to their real responsibility and raison d'etre.
I can jump in. So all these issues are interesting, and I think we'll get to all of them. But let's start with the freedom of speech, diversity of intellectual approach. I don't want to call it opinion because we're supposed to be scholars, but a diversity of approaches issue. And I really want to get at how you're handling this, in part because you have to be part of a larger academic culture. Let's just start from the basic one. You did this, I read up on your civics requirement, which I thought was brilliant. But if you hand the Stanford Political Science Department the charge of come up with a civics curriculum, they will edit, copy, edit, paste the New York Times 1619 project, and what will come out will be quite different from, I think, what you intended. So how in the world did you get a sensible civics requirement to be produced by a university?
I think we specified, John, first of all, what we were and weren't interested in. And it's probably useful to tell you how we did it as well as what we did. As in many other cases here, including our original commitment to the free speech statement that we labeled the Chicago Principles. We were the second school after University of Chicago wrote those to adopt them verbatim. It was done by our Board of Trustees. At this campus and in every other one I'm aware of, under every set of bylaws I've ever seen, they have the ultimate authority. Many cases have abdicated or forfeited it to administrators or faculty or both. But in both the case of our original free speech policy and the civics requirement, the Board of Trustees took charge of this. We commissioned a group of faculty here who had expressed an interest in this subject. It was really fairly broad-based here, and there were a few who disagreed, but the board has kept control of the process, as announced that at its meeting now, about 3 weeks off, we'll ratify and make it a final requirement here at the university. You know, I think that it will require continued vigilance. The point is, we want the eventual exam, not an onerous exam, nor are the pathways, the alternate pathways that a student can take before taking the exam, to be factual, to deal with the rudiments of our constitutional and civic traditions. But we've not had disagreement on that point. I think we tried to establish consensus that what we're out to do here is make certain our graduates understand the system we have. If they want to go out and change it, that's entirely their right as citizens, but that's not the point urging any particular differences from that system, not the point of this exercise or requirement.
Well, but there's different views about the nature of the system we have, as you know. But I think take your first answer as you have a well-chosen, engaged board of trustees that's doing their job and watching the henhouse, which seems to be an important part of university governance.
I absolutely believe that their word is law, and if they'll let it be. And so, in a number of cases, I'll give you another example. Our board doesn't go looking for disagreements or controversies, but a few years ago, after a very lengthy, typically lengthy, I guess I should say, faculty process, the Senate, as their group is called here, their representative group, came forward with a rewrite of our tenure and promotion policy. And although it took them 3 years, it wasn't very different from what had been there before. But our board, I think to the surprise of many, rejected it, or I should say, sent it back for more work, and insisted on 3 specific changes, which are now part of that policy. Just to illustrate, probably the most important is every faculty member seeking promotion or tenure must demonstrate, along with their teaching and research, that they have mentored students. They have invested some of their personal time in the development and growth of students. Known to be one of the most important things that can happen in a student's life on a residential campus, we wanted to make certain it was happening here. So that was one requirement. And in addition to that, we now give credit, or are supposed to, for entrepreneurial activity, once frowned upon and seen as at least a non-contributing factor, maybe even a detriment to advancing professionally here. And the last was the sponsorship of undergraduate research. Again, empirically, something that we know is associated with a higher quality, more valuable undergraduate experience. So the idea of a board of trustees asserting control over that was at least novel in modern times here, but something I think was a valuable in itself, and as a maybe a teaching moment about what governance really means.
I actually had a question for President Daniels. Henry Kissinger famously said that academic politics was toxic because the stakes were so low, and you're well positioned to judge whether that statement is true or false because you've now done your share of both kinds of politics. And I'm curious to look a little bit more closely at the campus politics you've experienced, because there are other actors that we haven't mentioned on most campuses that can sometimes play a disproportionate role in resisting change or advancing bad change. And I'm thinking here of faculty administrators, a very important group of people, which in some universities, Sam Abrams recently showed in an article in the New York Times, to the left even of faculty. And then the radical students, graduates and undergraduates, who often, though a minority, can be very influential over the direction that campus politics takes. So maybe give us a few insights into campus politics. I'm not asking you to give away any of the confidences and secrets that necessarily you have, but I think I'd be interested to know how it looks to somebody who actually cut his teeth on real politics.
Neil, it's everything you say is true. I will say that here at Purdue, we have all these issues, or we have actors of the kind you're describing. I think it's accurate to say that each of these phenomena is at a somewhat lower level here, and I attribute that to 2 things. One is our Midwestern upbringing. Only half our students and fewer than half of our grad students are from Indiana, but there's still a culture here that's, I think, a little more traditional than perhaps what y'all are familiar with. Maybe even more salient, though, is the fact that we are, much like Stanford now, very heavily a so-called STEM-based school. And although we're bigger than we've ever been and about to welcome the biggest class in history, we've been very purposely investing in those disciplines which we think are most valuable, most needed in a knowledge economy. And by the way, right in the middle of our land grant historical assignment, the mechanic arts, which today means engineering, computer science, mathematics, data science, all these, and the physical sciences, so forth. Something over 2/3 of our undergrads and a higher percentage of our grad students are in one of those areas. And I think that keeps things a little more rooted in the world of objective reality. And people are a little too busy, inventing the next breakthrough to spend all their time thinking about politics. With regard to students, we use the word disproportionate. It's correct. In my more flip moments, I'll sometimes say the 3 people in a cardboard sign, the media will treat as like the storming of the Bastille or something. But we show, I hope, always proper respect. I think my shorthand for this is respect, not deference. I've occasionally politely pointed out, to these young people, you're paying us a lot of money to come here because of what you don't know. And so we want to listen, and we get some good advice, and we do act on it. There's generally more agreement about ends than some people want to admit, and usually more going on in terms of means than they're aware of. So we certainly don't ever disregard, and we do look for all the possible common ground we can. But I'll just say that I think we're fortunate to have a little less difficulty than some. Going back to a previous matter that John raised, I should say one other thing, and Shelby Steele's a good example, by the way. We certainly have to live up to our free speech pronouncements, and so we don't try to dissuade people from inviting folks to campus, even those we think are peddling nonsense. But what we do insist on is people who are having speaker series, for example, balance that and provide some counterpoint to the folks who are more typically invited. So I think that's been a pretty good formula, and one that people of all persuasions here seem to accept.
Hey, Mitch, well, I'd like to ask you a question about really a question that you've asked, whether or not we can maintain our democracy. I think you've made the point I've seen in several fora in which you say, hey, democracy is not natural, right? It's not the default form of governance. And what's important, I think, is an educated populace, maybe more than any other factor, as well as maybe pride, pride in the fact, the gift that we do have a say in how we're governed, in the rights that we enjoy and the liberty that we enjoy. And I just wondered if you could give your assessment at Purdue, but maybe more broadly in academia. What is the degree to which our humanities departments are educating citizens so they can be full participants in our democracy and strengthen our democratic form of governance? I'm reminded of what Richard Rorty said. He said, that national pride is like self-respect in individuals, a necessary ingredient for self-improvement. And I do think that our curricula in the humanities has been tainted by at least a strain of what I would call almost self-loathing, especially since the end of the Vietnam War, in which we tend to teach our students that we are the problem, and I think as a result, our pride in who we are as a people and in our democratic principles, institutions, and processes is diminished by sort of this orthodoxy of self-loathing. Is that your assessment? And how do you feel about our ability to make progress and reform humanities curricula in a way that produces citizens that are capable of nurturing our republic?
I don't know if it'll be beyond my powers, and probably I think most to reform the way humanities are taught, at least over the near term. Whether how much injury this does to our republic and to all the necessary support you just mentioned, we'll have to see. I'm obstinately optimistic because I don't know another operating principle that makes sense, but I'm more troubled than I've been. And they said I could ask questions in a minute. I'm going to ask you about West Point, because I thought if there was anywhere with where some of this would would not intrude, it might be there. But I'm reading things that make me worry about that too. But let me just add one thing here. There's nothing. Everything you just said is right. By the way, self-loathing of their societies by intellectuals has a long tradition. I've read my Niall Ferguson and my Paul Johnson and others, and that's in fact that's an apt description that's been around for decades. It's just, I think, more it's if anything stronger and more monolithic today. Now, especially the last few years, it is fortified to me by the rather sudden control of information flow. Forget the academy for a minute, just what the average citizen, young or old, hears and reads and what comes at them through the algorithms of that you folks keep you devising out there for the rest of us. So that's a new problem that probably troubles me even more than what's been going on in higher ed, which is only worse by degree. So on either side of the college experience, there are new threats to me. The one I just mentioned, the dropping of any pretense of objectivity in journalism, the sort of propagandistic propensities that we now see. And on the other end, young people coming out of K-12 having been subjected to a degree of, in too many cases, a degree of indoctrination there. Faculty here have told me it used to be that students would show up in college and you have to worry about someone trying to indoctrinate them to despise their own country. Now, sometimes they arrive here having heard that at an even more impressionable age.
And maybe you should ask that West Point question. We don't have to.
Yeah, well, so Mitch, I am concerned about it. I should just say I'm on the board of visitors at West Point. So this is something that I'll be looking into. Of course, I trust the leadership there, the superintendent, but I am worried about how these kind of reified philosophies are now maybe infiltrating the military, where they can do the most damage, right? Because I think what happens is that these sort of ideas that that victimhood is the new heroism and that people ought to be judged mainly by their identity category rather than by their character or their courage or their toughness or their willingness to self-sacrifice, the principles that really we hold dear in our military and that are essential to combat effectiveness. That would be a disaster at West Point and in the military. And so I think that we just have to ask questions of our young people as well to get them to really actually be more critical about what they're hearing, in secondary education, in academia. And we should ask people, hey, do you really think it makes sense that we should judge people by their identity category rather than as Dr. Martin Luther King said, by the content of their character? And I think, of course, the answer ought to be a resounding no. Do you think our differences, right, our differences based on superficial differences, like skin color, for example, are more important than our common humanity, right? And so I just think that just by questioning, these philosophies, these orthodoxies, maybe we can help inspire a degree of skepticism in the younger generation. And that's where I have maybe more hope than maybe reform of academic departments, for example. And Mitch, I wonder, what is your sense of the student body, the younger generation that you interact with every day? Whenever I interact with young people here at Stanford in the courses that I teach and with my research assistants, those who I just interact broadly on campus, I come away from all those engagements encouraged, right? And so I wonder what your sense is of the younger generation, and do you share my hope that positive change could come from them as they reject these orthodoxies?
Yes, I do. We just had an extraordinarily positive, no surprise to me, but it was good to see it. I'll say battle tested experience here this last year. We kept Purdue open. We were probably more open. That is to say, residential for everyone who wanted to be here, which was almost everyone who could get here, over 90%, and in-person classes in the majority of cases, and so forth. We did everything we could think of as an institution to make that possible, but the sine qua non was the conduct of our students. They confounded all the skeptics. I got a very thick file of clippings and columns and some very hostile letters asserting that these young people would flaunt any rule or behavior we asked them to adopt, that they would hook up and drink up and otherwise defeat any preventive measures that we took. None of that was true. And better than that, they were plenty smart enough to know that they were at essentially zero risk from this, serious risk from this virus. They did what they did for others, to protect the vulnerable, their elders, their faculty, and protect the institution so it could stay open. So I thought it was a very, no surprise, but a very, very encouraging demonstration. The other thing I'll say is that one thing that's been reasonably common among young people over time is a rebellious streak against when they're being pressured or fed something, and maybe it'll assert itself here. Although I got to say that the process of pressing certain views on them as though they were gospel, and I use that term advisedly, is something we haven't seen in this society, at least, before.
So that does you have some advantages here. I was just talking to a University of Chicago professor who said that one of the great advantages of subscribing to the Chicago principles was it selects undergraduates who want to go there for free speech. And so by announcing that sort of thing, by being a beacon, you bring people who want to go there. But I want to go back to how you're doing it, which is, I'm still scratching my head. Let's take the faculty question for the moment. You did say we're going to STEM, but STEM isn't immune. But in many fields, there's just a monoculture. I don't know how you hire a conservative historian. Neil's here, but he's not available.
Well, not so fast, John. I was going to tell you all. I mean, I try to track how Hoover's being treated out there, and I just want to let you all know we have a very generous asylum policy here for those who are politically persecuted elsewhere. It's a very expeditious process. We can take you in very short order.
Well, do you? So does faculty hiring is not something a president can do. And I don't know how you even find conservative historians who've made it through the process anymore. How do you get faculty to be open to intellectual, ideological diversity, which in professions where there's practically none of it left?
I have no magic answer except to say that even those who do see the world in a very different way, do subscribe to the what I think you can correctly call the orthodoxy that prevails here, still will not, in most cases, disagree that diversity of thought is an important value. I think the most telling argument, and I've now had to answer questions about this and give speeches and so forth many, many times. I think the most, at least in the higher ed context, the most useful argument to be made is the one that Professor Whittington out of Princeton made in his recent book. It's a fairly obvious one, but not always invoked, and that is that in addition to to matters of justice and constitutionality and all of that, conformity of thought is a direct assault on the very mission of higher education, the advance of knowledge. Knowledge only progresses through the collision of ideas, and today's heretic is tomorrow's, accepted wisdom and so forth. And I think we've tried to keep that in front of people here too. And even though they we all struggle to live up to our principles, and we all, time to time, depart from them. And even those who do, I think, know that these are valid arguments, and don't challenge them frontally.
It strikes me you have a tremendous opportunity. The University of Chicago got great because in the 1930s it hired Jews when Harvard would not hire Jews. If you're willing to hire people of slightly unorthodox political opinions, it strikes me Purdue could strike out and get a generation of spectacularly good faculty in an otherwise very competitive market, and great students who might not otherwise come to Purdue. If you can say this is the place where we tolerate different ideas, and in fact you'll be exposed to different ideas, that seems like a tremendous opportunity. Is that part of your strategy here?
I don't know strategy, but I think it's something we're seeing play out on the student end. I can tell you, we don't tout this or emphasize it. I've been tempted to from time to time, sort of counter-programming of the way you're describing. But without doing that, every year in the entering class, there are students, I have to say, a lot of them come from the coast where you live, but elsewhere too, that or I'll hear from parents who detected something more balanced about this place, in addition to, I hope, other virtues of value and affordability that we talked about. So I don't have any question that it is operating somewhat in our favor now. And next, we may find out something about the first end of your question, because I mean the issue we're wrestling with here this week is we are growing again. Higher ed's been shrinking 2% a year now for a decade, probably going to shrink at faster rates now for reasons both demographic and economic. And but that's not our experience. And now we're going to have to hire even more faculty than the roughly 30 that were in our plan for this year. And I keep saying to our provost and others, this ought to be the best buyer's market we've seen in a while. There's probably going to be some folks on the market, or at least open to it, to a move because their own institutions aren't faring so well. So we'll see. But as you said earlier, people in my job don't hire faculty directly, probably shouldn't. And so you have to just try to set a tone and try to get people to sign on to basic principles that could lead to that outcome.
My observation, and it's based on some recent research as well as my own observation, is that in many ways the problem does not lie with undergraduates, and it doesn't even necessarily lie with faculty. The problem is with people who are relatively junior but pursuing academic careers. Now, a recent report that came out from Eric Kaufman, who's London-based, but the report surveyed institutions in the US, Canada, and the UK, had a really shocking statistic. It asked if people in the survey would vote to oust a dissenting academic if an academic held views on a range of issues from diversity to traditional parenthood to empire. And amongst the PhDs in the US and Canadian institutions, 49% of those surveyed said they would support one or other of these campaigns to oust a dissenting, that is to say, right-leaning academic. 49%, much, much higher than for the established faculty. And this reminded me of an observation one of my old Harvard colleagues made the other day, that the problem's the graduate students. The problem is that the people who have self-selected to pursue academic careers, for a variety of reasons that have to do with the way you get an academic job, are highly conformist and highly committed to woke ideology. So when a university sets out to hire and bring in a new junior faculty, from the point of view of intellectual diversity, the pool, certainly in social sciences and humanities, the pool is already enormously skewed to the left. And it's a very illiberal left that we're talking about now, because this readiness to essentially campaign to have a colleague fired for dissenting political views is no longer regarded as taboo. Overt political discrimination, as Eric Kaufman's report makes clear, is absolutely all right, especially in the eyes of junior people in the system. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. And I have a second question, which has to do with why relatively few other academic institutions have followed your example in signing up for the Chicago principles. I don't actually have a score at the moment of how many it
80.
is.
It's not as bad as you think. There's 80.
Well, tell me something a bit about why it's not everybody, because you'd have thought that this was a no-brainer. I mean, who could be against the fundamental notion that a campus should be a place where there's free thought and
we're trying to get that to happen at Stanford, and we'll have on another GoodFellows we can discuss just how that's going.
Yeah, that was one reason maybe why it crossed my mind as a question. But maybe start with the problem of just recruiting people into academia, because right now I get the sense that relatively few people right of center are considering this as an option, and one can't really blame them because it seems like a sort of hopeless task.
Or Neil, they leave. I mean, I know people at the PhD student who come in and they're all excited about it, and then they see a job market that, except for Purdue and Hoover, requires daily genuflecting at woke altars and say, "Oh, what the heck? I'm going to go get a real job."
It depends on the discipline, of course. Our PhD students in the main are not headed for careers in academe. They're being snapped up by top companies and the research organizations and so forth. So setting those aside, everything you say, I can't disagree with. It's manifestly so. I'm tempted to suggest that in the current situation, they might be happy to evict somebody so there's a spot for them. The real issue, if you're a PhD candidate right now, is where are you planning to go? Even a few years ago, first meeting I attended of the research university organization, the topic on the table was they talked about the LaGuardia effect. Too many people circling too few landing spots, and it's gotten much worse since with the contraction or the flattening, at least, of college-going populations and so forth. So, I mean, your chances as one of those PhD candidates that you just talked about of being hooded and then moving into an academic job in some college or university are astonishingly small now. I don't know where they're going, honestly, but I don't know. Maybe we can take some comfort from some of that. On the Chicago principles, I don't like doing this, but I think I can actually claim a little paternity for the term, because we were early, and it just seemed to me so obvious that instead of trying to draft our own, here's this perfectly, clear and good statement. By the way, you probably know, but the committee that wrote it at Chicago was led by Professor Stone, and who was a 60s liberal. He's a very senior, distinguished constitutional law professor there, and but he understood free speech. He grew up promoting free speech so that the left would not be regimented off of campus or punished in some way or limited in their speech. He's always understood the value of dissent from that perspective, and found himself in strange company when, in the current situation, when those who are embracing those principles more often are worried about the opposite problem. I had the same experience with someone who became a good friend, Nadine Strawson, who was the longtime leader of the American Civil Liberties Union, which no longer seems quite as interested in civil liberties. That's a different podcast too. But both of them had been sort of reality mugged by this new situation in which in which it seemed, in which their allies in trying to defend these longtime principles, were the people they once contended with. No, I thought that the virtue of us all signing one thing, I always thought about the Sullivan principles on apartheid. They had more power because and every company didn't try to write its own version. Everybody just signed up to one, then everyone understood it. And I still hope something like that is happening here. I do think the worm has turned in a very small way. We've had fewer people, even before the pandemic, somewhat fewer incidents of disinvitations, speakers shouted down or physically harassed. I think there'd been a little embarrassment from the excesses there. At least I hope so.
And I agree, by the way, one of the odd couples in this space is Robbie George and Cornel West. And this is an opportunity for me to plug the Academic Freedom Alliance, which Robbie George and others have got off the ground. And my sole claim to fame really is that I had the idea of NATO for professors, with an Article 5 stating that an attack on one is an attack on all. And this was a newspaper column. Robbie George said, "Are you going to do this?" And I said, "I'm not sure I got time to do this." He said, "Well, I'm going to do it." So the Academic Freedom Alliance now exists, and you should be encouraging your faculty to join. Mitch.
I will.
Hey, I was just going to ask you, President Daniels, what other ideas you have about bringing our society back together, right? I mean, strengthening the fabric of our society, reversing this severe polarization. We've talked about some of the causes. Some of the causes is maybe this orthodoxy of self-loathing and victimization as the new, or victimhood as the new heroism and so forth. These reified theories and compounded by social media, the information environment broadly to which our citizens are subjected. But what other opportunities do you see to maybe reverse this polarization, to restore our confidence in who we are as a nation? I mean, are there opportunities for public service, for example, and serving fellow citizens that can provide an opportunity, I think, for people to work together from diverse backgrounds and to really see the conventional wisdom that they've been, or the theories that have been foisted upon them melt away and exposed for what they are. What else are you doing on campus, and what other ideas do you have to help bring us back together?
General, I wish I had that answer. I hope so, and I hope with eventually some. I hope it's something other than a cataclysm. I mean, it might actually take the both either a common threat or a common danger, or it might take the demonstrated failure of the at least currently dominant set of policies and values to bring about, to bring out of hiding, if that's where they are, this so-called exhausted middle that we were talking about not too long ago, but to me has been harder to find lately as the tribes have become a little more rigid, it seems. In days of yore, which means 8 years ago, I had a tour in elective office. It was not a federal office, and that's significant because it meant that you were dealing with more practical problems if one chose to, and much less often dragged into these yes/no binary cultural fights. And but for somebody just did a program and brought some of that back to mind, I realized, boy, how dated that seems. I just don't know if that sort of appeal can work anymore. Worked just great here right up until I changed jobs, but we've seen a lot of shift in the last few years, and the idea of talking about politics by addition, not division, of de-emphasizing labels of either party or ideology in favor of the search for a compromise and common purpose and common actions. I'd love to think that there's something like that can work at the national level, but right now it seems that seems remote.
I can't help interjecting that if somebody were to write a book about cataclysms, they'd be likely to observe that we just had quite a big one. Certainly, I think we'd all agree that more than 500,000 excess dead in the US is pretty cataclysmic by historic standards. And it didn't bring us together, quite the opposite. To me, it's actually quite surprising how far we became more polarized over the past year, and everything became partisan. I've been thinking a lot about that this week, talking about the book Doom. It's not kind of something you necessarily would have anticipated beforehand if you told somebody, well, what happens to American sentiment if there's a huge pandemic? A lot of us would have said, well, if there's some new virus that comes from China, I would guess that would reduce partisan division, but it didn't.
I think we come together if we see our government as being competent in its response, and then everyone chips in. But the minute you see it being completely incompetent in its response, then you go back to fighting among each other. Okay, can I ask Mitch one last question? HR wants to save the world. I want to be a university administrator. So just a couple of related to university administrator questions. A lot of our problems are not external speakers, they're classroom self-censorship. And even Chicago's having problems that the staff doesn't really, the principles are nice on top, but they don't get implemented. People get in trouble for little things they say in class. Similarly, one thing that's been on my mind is if we care about viewpoint diversity, we should try to measure it. Our universities are very good at measuring all sorts of racial and social and other kinds of self-identifications. And I tried to ask our provost, why don't we, if you care about viewpoint diversity, just who's a registered Republican? Are there any around here? Who goes to church regularly? What are your self-identified political things? It seems like something one could measure. I'm curious if you went there. And last one, because choose whichever of these you think is interesting. Admissions seems like a great place for a university to go against. The new thing is no grades, no test scores. We can't do that sort of stuff. It strikes me a university who says, yeah, if you're a kid who can pass it, if you're an Asian kid who can get a good test score, we'll let you in and overlook everything else, would be a great way to let underlooked people in and also to get a spectacular student body. So those are three sort of ways in which your university administrator could be, or maybe you have thoughts on how you are fighting these trends.
Well, I'll deal with the last one first. We still, as soon as we can, we'll be requiring tests as we have. That's for the most, empirical of reasons. Our folks have analyzed this. It's been analyzed by all kinds of people. There is no combination of criteria anyone has discovered or devised that omits standardized tests from its top 2 or 3 or 4 factors in decision. That is as predictive of the eventual student success, and that the eventual student success is what we're after.
Let me just interrupt because the tests were put in originally to allow people who were kind of from nowhere, kind of didn't know anybody, kind of had a bad background to prove that they were good. So it's tests are an inclusive thing, not an exclusive.
That's right. They were devised by a Jewish person in the late 30s when Jews were being excluded by quota and so forth in just the way that it appears in some places, maybe Asian American students are today. So we encouraged tests this last year. Many students couldn't get to a testing center, and there was that. So you had to have a lot of flexibility, and we did. But we intend to stay with it. It does no good, we believe, to admit students who can't meet our standards. Now, there's 2 ways you can deal with it. You can relax the rigor, which we have tried to preserve. There's it's statistically harder to get a good grade here than at most other schools, and I hope we'll preserve that delta. It tells the world that if you leave with a Purdue degree, you probably learned something. It's not just a proxy for the fact you had enough smarts to get in the first place. And so for that reason, I expect testing to remain a part of our process, which of course looks at many other factors, but is aimed at assembling a class of students who, if they'll work hard, can succeed in a fairly rigorous environment.
So President Daniels, we have just a couple minutes left on this show, and I'd like to give you the last word. GoodFellows is forward-looking at all times, and I constantly drive these 3 gentlemen crazy by asking them, okay, what's next? So let me pose this question to you, then let's sign off. The next pandemic, the next time universities face this situation, what do university presidents, what do faculty, what do parents, what do prospective students, what do they need to be thinking about? Because as Neil will tell you, it's not a matter of when, if, but when we once again go through the experience. So what do we do the next time?
Yeah, well, there's a typically cheery thought from Dr. Ferguson, but he's probably right, as he almost always is. Well, look, my own view is that the historians of the not too distant future will look back with fairly harshly on the way people in positions of responsibility handled themselves this last year. As I've said over and over, in any position of significant responsibility, the whole essence, you could say, of the assignment is the balancing of competing interests and the choice among priorities. And the trade-offs that are inevitable in any endeavor of any size or complexity. And what we saw over and over again this last year were people taking a very tunnel vision view, in too many cases playing to a gallery that was happy to applaud them for that, and in the process inflicting enormous collateral damage, economic damage, other health consequences, the education, especially of younger children, disadvantaged children. You know all this. And I think that when that score is toted up fairly, as eventually it will be, I hope there's an object lesson there for people who have to face the next pandemic. I think that process may already have started. I just want to add one quick thing, because there's a piece of John's last question I didn't answer, that something that may interest you. There was a bill in the Indiana General Assembly this last year that aimed to get at some of this, and in its original form, it suggested that we ought to go around, put some sort of a designation on our faculty, how many of this, how many of that. I really thought that was not a good or useful idea. I wouldn't know how to do it. I thought it was invasive. I thought it would spur a lot of natural resentment. However, I think a better alternative came up, and that is a survey of students in the public universities of this state, which is supposed to take place later this year. I hope it'll be simple, plain, unambiguous. Questions like, do you feel free to speak up in class? Have you ever felt you were being preached to as opposed to taught how to think for yourself? Do you worry about retaliation if you were to express either from faculty or from fellow students? If you did express a viewpoint that was unpopular or different, those kind of questions. So I don't know where it will wind up, but I think that could be a very useful enterprise or undertaking. And we will certainly cooperate fully with it when the thing is put together. I think there have been some data about this around the country. They're not surprising, and it's showing how many young people. I hate to raise a generation of cynics. The Soviets raised several of them who, had to lie to get by and all those sorts of things. And we're not there, but I don't want to get close to there. And perhaps a little sunshine on this subject could help. And if the experience here is a useful one, maybe it'll be emulated, which is one thing our federal system still does very well.
President Daniels, we enjoyed the conversation. If you want to get any or all these gentlemen to work for you, very simple. Send them an email with real estate prices in West Lafayette, Indiana.
Oh, yeah.
Problem solved. So that's it for this episode of GoodFellows. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. We'll be back next week with a new topic, a new conversation for you. If you want to know more about Purdue University, that fine school whose name you see on the back of President Daniels, who not coincidentally is wearing a black sweater and gold shirt, Army colors, right, HR? Very simple. Go to the website, www.purdue.edu. Mitch Daniels also is fearless. He is on Twitter. His Twitter handle is @PurdueMitch, PurdueMitch, @PurdueMitch. On behalf of Hoover's GoodFellows, Niall Ferguson, HR McMaster, John Cochrane, our special guest today, Purdue University President Mitch Daniels, we wish you and yours the very best. Stay safe, stay healthy. We'll do our best here at the Hoover Institution to help you stay informed. We'll see you next week. Go Boilermakers.
If you enjoyed this show and are interested in watching more content featuring HR McMaster, watch Battlegrounds, also available at hoover.org.